Welcome back, history fans! It's time for another episode of the Scotland series. We just got done covering the epic Battle of Stirling Bridge, the first major victory for the Scots in their war for independence. But of course, one victory doesn't necessarily mean the end of a war. The months that followed the Battle of Stirling Bridge were busy ones for William Wallace. Though the English did not make any fresh attack, the country was in shambles from the constant warring. Some kind of order needed to be restored before King Edward moved his troops up north again. For the Scots knew that Longshanks, as the old king was sometimes called, because he was so tall. Well, not really that tall, I guess. He was 6'2", but the average man at this point is said to have been about 5'4", so I guess if that's true, in comparison, Edward would have earned the name Longshanks. Anyhow, the Scots knew that King Edward would not give up on them so easily. Scotland needed to be fortified for freedom. One of the first things was to reestablish some of the trade that had been lost with Europe, in order to get more food, supplies, and money in general running through the country. We don't know very much about the business that Scotland had with the nations on the mainland at this point, but there is a document in an old library in Lübeck, Germany, that asks for trade to be reopened. This at least tells us that there were dealings with Germany. The document is dated in October, and is signed with both Wallace's and Andrew Moray's seals. Since the Battle of Stirling Bridge happened on September 11th, Andrew was still likely alive at that time, and though ailing from his wounds, was still doing his utmost to aid Wallace and administration, and had put his seal to the paper. Also, Wallace decided not to wait until the English came to them. Instead, they would take the fight to the English. This was actually a rather cruel thing for Wallace to do. Instead of attacking King Edward, his nobles, or his soldiers directly, he would mostly be attacking common people, who probably had nothing to do with the war at all. Wallace was acting just as cruelly in England as King Edward had done in Scotland. A large part of Northumberland, and even a sliver of Cumberland, were subjected to the wrath of the Scots. Burning and pillaging were the rule of the day. Thankfully, there was no massacre, for Wallace at least restrained his men from needless killing. Some have justified the Scots' deeds by claiming that they had to gather more food and money to keep fighting the war, since their own country had been devastated. Others have said that if Wallace did not keep his men busy doing something, they would have all just gone back to their homes, and wouldn't have been ready for the next time the English attacked. But whatever the reasons, nothing can change the truth that it was a very base and dishonorable thing to do. Especially coming from a guy who said words like these. Freedom is never something that should be separated from justice. In January of 1298, there was a change in the winds of war. King Philip IV, or King Philip the Fair, as he was often called, made a truce with King Edward, and the wars in France came to a standstill. King Edward didn't waste much time once his hands were free of that conflict. He turned all his energies now to the crushing of Scotland. By March, he had sailed across the English Channel and landed back in his home country. His first step was to move the seat of government to York, instead of London, so that he could be closer to the site of conflict. Both English and Scottish barons were summoned to the city and told to bring their men and weapons with them. When none of the Scottish barons presented themselves, they were at once branded as traitors. The war was on. The nobles of Scotland could see that it was critically important for them to choose a leader to guide them in this new phase of the war. They must choose someone with enough authority to lead their armies and to override the prevalent political infighting. They turned to Wallace. He was certainly worthy of the position, being a natural leader of men, and largely indifferent to the inner warring between the nobles. In the same month that Edward left the shores of France, a small ceremony was held in a church buried within the forest of Falkirk. Well, a church that used to be buried in the forest. It isn't anymore, as you can see. And this is a plaque on the church commemorating the event, which I didn't actually know that FDR's ancestors are buried here. I should look that up. But I better not get sidetracked with that right now. The point is, this is a church where Wallace was officially made the guardian of Scotland, the country's appointed leader, until the true king should come to the throne. Edward's first stop in Scotland was Kirkliston. He would have liked to go further, but due to bad weather, his supplies coming in by ship were delayed. 2 weeks dragged by. The Welsh troops were also being rather unruly, which did nothing to help the king's spirits. Eventually, they ended up making it to Linlithgow, but things were still going very poorly. Edward decided to pull back to Edinburgh and reassess the campaign. As the English army toiled along their march toward the southern city, a spy came in with a report that the Scots had been spotted in the Torwood nearby. The spy said that the Scots were seeking the king's army in order to harass them as they drew back to Edinburgh. It was a true report. Hounding a retreating force was a favorite tactic of Wallace. But this time, the quarry was not some chicken-hearted English baron. It was the Lion of England himself that the Scots were hunting. "I would not suffer them to seek me," Edward said fiercely. Instead of hasting along to Edinburgh, he stood his ground in Falkirk, hard by the Torwood, and readied his troops for battle. Wallace saw that the game was up, and he too began to get the men in fighting order. He would have to plan very carefully, for once again, the Scots were heavily outnumbered by their foes. Primarily, the English had an upper hand in cavalry, which was something the Scots had not yet been able to develop. Horses were not so easy to come by, you see. And yet, for all that, the Scots had their own secret weapon of defense against the English war machine of the knight beside his destrier. They had their skiltrons. A skiltron was a kind of battle formation made up of foot soldiers armed with pikes. The men would stand so close together that their shields would lock over each other, with only the deadly tips of the pikes sticking out. Sometimes some of the men would kneel down on the ground and support their pike in the earth behind them. while another row behind them would stick out their pikes just over the first row's heads. Thus, a deadly wall was formed that none but the most reckless horseman would dare to throw himself against. Here's another example of a skiltring. The concept is actually said to have been based upon the Saxon and Viking idea of a shield wall, which I talked about a little bit back in my series on King Alfred. And you can tell from the pictures, shields weren't always used in skiltrons, but it was still pretty effective without them. And here's a third example. It's from a movie, and the pikes aren't even accurate. I mean, seriously, they don't even have proper tips on them. But the formation is what we're looking at here. That part's actually accurate. Imagine riding a horse into that thing. Yeah, pretty effective defense strategy. But the skiltrons had never been put to such a great test as this before. Could they withstand the might of Longshanks?